All right. So, fingers crossed this actually works. And let me start by saying I imagine that many of you are, like me, quite taken with what we're learning from the special committee conducting public hearings now into the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th. And not only the invasion, but the months long planning to disrupt or overturn the outcomes of the popular election of November of 2020. And I will, once those hearings are further along, spend some time talking about what we're learning from them with you. And I want to be clear. I think some of it is stuff we already knew and is just being reinforced. Some of it is, in fact, revelatory, and both how dangerous this was for particular individuals and perhaps our democracy as a whole, and how concerted and desperate the planning was to try to overturn the election orchestrated by the president and members of his staff and inner circle at the White House, I think are cause for deep concern about the health of American democracy, the fragility of its central institutions, the appetite for less democratic, more authoritarian alternatives on the part of a substantial segment of the electorate and an important segment of one of our two main parties. So this is not trivial stuff. But having said that, I think part of what we see there's one particular incident where Eastman is asked, what would the Supreme Court say about your proposal to allow the vice president to throw out the results of the electoral college? And he says, oh, they'd probably shoot it down 9-0, right? That the courts were important in playing their role in our constitutional machinery, in checking the excesses of the executive branch, that they established that the allegations of voting fraud had no factual basis, and that they stood in the background to uh, both check executive overreach, an effort to thwart democracy, and perhaps also to scare or intimidate away from Donald Trump some of his followers in his administration, who I think quite realistically recognize that going along with Trump and trying to overturn the election might ultimately land them in jail, right? And that the result is, in a sense, fortunately for our democracy, that Trump was left surrounded by less competent people in December and January, I guess, the second half of November of 2020, 2021. So all of that to say, I am going to continue talking about the Supreme Court, the judiciary, the Constitution today, in part because I think it remains every bit as relevant, not only because we seem to be on the cusp of having Roe v. Wade overturned, that we're about to witness what I would argue will be a judicial sea change in the way in which the Constitution is overturned and the philosophy that underpins the interpretive stance of the majority of the Supreme Court, and hence in the way in which the Constitution functions as both structuring and limiting ordinary politics, that there's a real importance to continuing with this topic. And so that is what I am going to do. Today's lecture, I will try to conclude the lecture series, and I'm going to look at a broad swath of material, starting with more historical considerations about how we got the Constitution and the institution of judicial review, and then how they evolved over their 240-year history, and then moving into the contemporary period, looking at the idea that perhaps not all is well with constitutional democracy and the institution of judicial review, and that it is past time to begin considering some reforms. So, to summarize quickly, um, I have tried to convince you in the previous few weeks of a few propositions. The first is that the Supreme Court today is a very different institution than it was 50 years ago, and that is because an untold sum of dark money has been poured into a sustained, patient, careful, intelligent campaign to rehabilitate conservative ideas in the American legal culture, eventually to accumulate a stable of conservative lawyers to repopulate the federal judiciary with people who think very differently about law and the Constitution than had the members of the federal bench and the Supreme Court for the middle of the 20th century. Right. And that this campaign is now successful. We now have 2/3 of the Supreme Court subscribing to some kind of originalist interpretive approach to the Constitution, an approach that says that the Constitution can be understood by the justices of the Supreme Court best by understanding what it meant or how it was interpreted by people who were contemporaneous to its drafting and ratification. And that this is strongly in tension with an alternative interpretive stance, which I think, in a sense, is really a family of interpretive stances that share the basic idea that we are not bound by 18th century views of the Constitution, that the Constitution contains language that requires interpretation, and that we, the denizens of the 21st century, are free to interpret it according to our standards, our ideas, our meanings, our principles. And in so doing, we bring the Constitution, an 18th century document, into the 21st century, make it not only relevant to, but legitimate to us or for us. That this is the way in which popular sovereignty over the Constitution is preserved within the Constitution. And so the change from what I'm calling a living Constitution approach to an originalist approach in the federal bench as a whole, right? It's now the case that the majority of judges in the federal appellate court system have been appointed by Republicans, and the vast majority of them are originalists, and a strong supermajority in the Supreme Court seems to mean also that the current originalist judges are overcoming some of the reticence of previous generations of more conservative judges with regards to precedent, settled law, or stare decisis, that they are willing now to be a little bit more aggressive in overturning the decisions that stem from the earlier era, the mid-century era, in which there was a majority on the court of people who subscribe to a different judicial philosophy, rather than saying, okay, well, we have to respect what they did, even if we disagree with the interpretive stance that led to it, because it has become the settled law of the land, because people build their lives on the understanding that this is the rights, these are the procedures, this is the law. They are, it appears, increasingly aggressively overturning or upending the work of previous courts, and hence the claim that there will be a sea change in constitutional law that we are just beginning to see, but that we would do well to anticipate continuing over at least a decade. And third, that this change is a frontal assault on the way in which the majority of Americans understand their Constitution, and so that it puts the court at loggerheads with not just the policy preferences, which are uh, less stable, less deep often than the constitutional convictions of Americans. If the Supreme Court says you may like this policy, but it's not permitted by the Constitution, and if you frame the question correctly, you actually will agree that this is not what you have committed to in terms of your constitutional principles, that's one thing. But if it simply says we interpret the Constitution differently from you do, from the way you do, and it puts itself in the position to consistently override the constitutional views of a majority of Americans, it potentially undercuts its own authority. It begs the question, why should 9 people, and I've shown you appointed by presidents who didn't win the majority vote, by a Senate that doesn't represent the majority of the population, get to tell the majority of the population you're wrong about what the Constitution means. The idea that we need some final arbiter of constitutional interpretation is important, but it isn't carte blanche. It isn't a blank check for the Supreme Court to do whatever it wants, completely disregarding the view of many Americans, and in seeming disregard for the fact that they were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote, were confirmed by senators who do not represent the majority of the population. One would think that might chasten them, might lead them to be a little bit more cautious in the way that perhaps John Roberts is indicating that he would prefer, but that no longer seems to be the majority view of the conservatives on the Supreme Court. And so I worry that the result of this will be something of a constitutional crisis, a bit of an overused term these days, but a crisis in the sense that the institution that we look to stand above the partisan fray, to call us to our senses when we lose track of our constitutional principles, to be a principled forum for resolving disputes of constitutional interpretation, is going to lose the respect, the standing, the legitimacy it requires to do its work. Briefly, a little bit of evidence that this is in fact already happening. This is a Marquette University poll that's done on a regular basis, 3-4 times a year, about what people think about the Supreme Court. Do they approve or disapprove? It's one way to gauge whether or not the court is maintaining its legitimacy. And I would note that in the late period of 2020, the early period of 2021, people are generally approving of the court. And I think that may be in part because it's perceived as being a check against an overreaching executive, right? And there are a number of decisions in this period that indicate that the court is reining in the authoritarian tendencies of Donald Trump. As we transition into Joe Biden, the court seems to lose some of that luster. And in particular, in the aftermath of the publication, the leaking of Samuel Alito's draft opinion overturning Roe v. Wade, its approval rating takes a sharp downturn, right? And so if we compare, right, and I don't want to get too caught up. Obviously, this is not an elected institution. We shouldn't be reading the tea leaves with it every month, but that there does seem to be a sharp decline in approval of the Supreme Court, and that I suspect if Roe is actually overturned, if that is the harbinger of a number of other decisions that the Supreme Court is going to take that overturn or contradict most people's understanding of what the Constitution means, that it will continue to slide downwards in the esteem of many Americans. And so then coming back to this framework, the fourth and final thing I've tried to argue with you, and the special inquiry into the invasion of the Capitol is certainly making my job easier, that we are at a dangerous moment for American democracy. And we perhaps have the benefit of historical hindsight, having seen other democracies collapse or slide into authoritarianism, to learn from the recent past that um, democracy is not self-stabilizing, that it can decline, backslide, eventually and often incrementally transform into a form of government which is less committed to the peaceful transition of power via regular free elections and the accompanying respect for the rule of law. And that in those circumstances, it's especially important to have a respected federal judiciary to backstop democracy. That in our institutional structure, it is the judiciary's job to enforce the rule of law. Those rules include, though they are not limited to, the maintenance of the fairness, the openness, and the decisiveness of the electoral process. I don't want to claim that our court is perfectly upholding that ideal. Obviously, if you're like me, you think that there is way too much money in American politics, that our districting is way too partisan, that one party is increasingly trying to use asymmetrical access to the ballot as a tool for winning elections. But having said that, on balance, I think the court still has an extremely important role to play. It could be doing it better. To play that role, it needs its legitimacy. I won't review for today all of the forces that are undermining democracy in America. Uh, the right economic, cultural change, the demographic shift. As I was preparing for this lecture, I was looking over some of the literature on partisanship, and I was reminded the idea that many of the scholars on American and American political parties uh, converge on, which is that we've always had a white supremacist political party in the United States since the end of Reconstruction, that it was the Democrats for a long time, that when the Democrats shifted over to supporting civil and voting rights legislation in the mid-1960s, there was an opening for Barry Goldwater and then Richard Nixon, and that since then there's been a real shift with the Democratic Party becoming the party that accommodates diversity, and the Republican Party in an increasingly all-white party that is embracing an agenda that tries to, on the one hand, slow or limit the diversity of the United States, and on the other hand, continue to assert the privilege of citizens of European descent, and that this is a second big challenge to democracy, that our institutions have become less responsive, that unions have declined substantially when they were the main institutions for inclusion, a sense of community, but also a sense of balancing or countervailing the power of corporations and the wealthy, that the result is that democratic responsiveness and inclusion feels increasingly closed down, that central institutions captured. Our media system, I think it goes without saying, is a mess. That if you read or watch the leading institutions, the best newspapers, CNN, PBS, ABC, etc. You may not be as sensitive to this, but the majority of Americans get their news from social media. And that is an increasingly anarchic environment in which there is no verification or fact checking, in which what circulates is determined by how rapidly and effectively it captures your attention. And therefore, there's a built in radicalization dynamic, and that is deeply distorting public discourse in contemporary America. Finally, as noted, we have a party, the Republican Party, that seems to be increasingly drifting in an authoritarian, anti-democratic, populist direction. I think it's worthwhile noting that although we continue to get information about how dangerous the conduct of the President Trump was in the buildup to and as January 6th was unfolding, this has not eroded his support from key leaders within the Republican Party or a vital constituency without which those leaders cannot hope that their party will be electorally viable. So, having said all of that, let me now get into the history. And as I've said to you last week, I'm drawing on three main texts here, although as you'll see, I'm going to bring in a bunch of other texts as well. Michael Claremann's The Framers' Coup, which is this compendious history of the making of the Constitution, its ratification. And as he puts it in the introduction, one of the main tasks is to demythologize both the framers and the document they produced. More on that in a moment. Larry Kramer's The People Themselves, Popular Constitutionalism and Judicial Review. And looking at Kramer and Claremann together for a moment, one thing you get from reading their text is the very strong sense that in the era of the founding, many people believed in popular constitutionalism. That is to say that the people themselves, as Kramer puts it, were opposed to the framers' coup and continued to assert and demand some input into the meaning of the Constitution, a Constitution which was passed in the name of the people, we the people of the United States, right, as it famously declares in its preamble. And that therefore, if we are looking for the way in which the Constitution was understood, its meaning in the 1780s, part of what we should discover is that it was understood to be an expression of popular sovereignty, and that popular sovereignty wasn't understood as a once and done affair. We get to be popularly sovereign in 1789 to 1791, and then it's over, right? But as a continuous project. And so in that sense, I agree with Ronald Dworkin that originalism isn't just an inferior, it is an incoherent approach to interpreting the Constitution, not only because the Constitution requires creative interpretation. Its language doesn't just invite, it necessitates the active participation of the interpreter using their standards to make sense of it, but also because if we are interested in the original understanding of the Constitution, its original understanding, at least one strain of it, is the idea that it is the people's law and that the people continue to have input into how it is interpreted, and that that input is dispersed. It's not concentrated exclusively in the judiciary. It's there in Congress, it's there in the presidency, and it is therefore ultimately responsive to popular views about what the Constitution means. The third book, Jason Frank's Constituent Moments, looks at that phrase, "we the people," and notes that although that is the phrase in which the Constitution was enacted, the authority claimed, it itself was contested in post-revolutionary America. Did this mean only propertied men, or as this protest
Precisely.
for franchise indicates, right, in the same period, that the uh, meaning of the people, the scope of the people, the bounds of the people was something that those who were not currently included, not enfranchised, were contesting, right? And the diagram shows a bunch of working men in their aprons and working clothes, as well as African Americans. Of course, it doesn't yet include women, but as we know from Abigail Adams' letters and writings, it was the case that many women thought it should include them as well. All right, so now let's go into that history in some detail. And as is my wont, I'm going to go back to John Locke, the great 17th century English political philosopher whose two treatises of government was the most cited work at the time of the founding. Bernard Bailyn makes the case in the ideological origins of the American Revolution that you really can't understand what's going on in the American Revolution without understanding what happened in the 17th century British revolutions. And among the things that Locke provides us with in the second treatise on government, the original constructive part of his work, is a very important account of the distinction between what he calls constitutive power and ordinary legislative power. Just a moment of context here, right? Locke was a revolutionary. He wrote or drafted the two treatises in 1679, 1680, at a moment of standoff, what comes to be called the succession crisis, because the current king has no male children. And so his brother is the heir to the throne. His brother is Catholic. The Parliament of Britain, a dominantly Protestant society, says we do not agree to be ruled by a Catholic king. We want to exclude him from the throne. In the end, he actually does take up the throne, and the Glorious Revolution occurs, in which William and Mary sail over from Holland, and James flees, and we get a new Protestant monarchy that has the blessings of Parliament. And so part of what Locke is arguing for in the two treatises is parliamentary supremacy over the monarchy, right? A constitutional monarchy does not have a supreme right of its king. Its king's right depends on the consent of the people as expressed through Parliament. And the reason that that is the case is because both the king and the parliament depend for their legitimate authority on the people's consent. They have the right to make and execute the law only because it has been delegated to them, vested in them by the people, and that the way in which the people have done this is an expression of the people's supreme constitutive power, their sovereignty, their natural right to freedom, and their willingness to surrender some of their natural right to institutions in order to do only specified work, so that in this sense, the legislature and the executive derive their power from. Their power is parasitic on popular sovereignty, right? And this idea of constitutive power is clearly echoed in our term constitutional law. They both refer to the fact that there is a higher order of law that indicates then how the ordinary lawmaking procedures will be structured. The law that is made within those procedures is ordinary positive law, not constitutional law. It can be revoked or modified, mutated many times as the popular majority changes within the legislature. But one of the reasons we ask the legislature to do this work is so that we have a stable rule of law. It is incompatible with decrees or the transfer of legislative power to the executive. When we turn to the other side of the ledger, constitutive power, this kind of law is a higher order of positive law. It is irrevocable and unalterable by ordinary legislation. The only time it can be changed is by the people themselves. And when the people are using this constitutive highest order power to make this highest order law, they aim for universal, explicit, and direct consent. This is not ordinary majorities represented by parties. This is a higher threshold of justification that reflects the ideal of a self-governing people. Now, I go on that little detour into 17th century British political philosophy because it is extremely important to understanding the genealogy and the transformation of American constitutional ideas. And so let us look at that genealogy and transformation for a couple minutes. We start with these ideas, right, that come from Locke and the Levelers and the Diggers, the English Civil War and the Great Revolution, the glorious revolution, sorry, of the 17th century. But I want to be as clear as possible. The Americans don't simply import those ideas from Britain, they change those ideas along the way. And historians like Gordon Wood and Bernard Bailyn have been important in illuminating this, that the idea that Locke was appealing to was really an idea of revolution in a much more conservative sense. And here, the original meaning of revolution as it's used in science and planetary science by people like Galileo is that the earth, right, revolves around the sun, and that once a year the earth returns to the position it was at exactly a year before. And that what a revolution in politics does is return the people, its government, the society, to the legitimate order that had been disrupted by bad actors and actions, right? And so in this sense, the revolution restores the traditional constitution. In the British context, this is a constitution that traces back to the Magna Carta or time immemorial. There's no sense of the people actually writing a new constitution as a result of the revolution. But when we get to the American context, this changes, and it, in a sense, has to change because the American revolutionaries are working in the context of colonial states, right? And so their constitutions say that they are governed by king and parliament. And that's exactly what they're trying to escape. They can't restore that constitution. They tear up those colonial charters, and then they have constitutional assemblies where delegates are elected or appointed, and then the state constitutions are themselves ratified by the people enfranchised within the state. And the result is that this idea of the power of the people who are sovereign to determine and enforce their constitution becomes a much more original and constructive power over the course of the American Revolution. It now includes the right of the people to author their constitution, not merely to protect or restore their constitution as necessary. This idea emerges in the states and then comes to inform the writing of the federal constitution, and then very quickly is exported to France, where it gets perhaps a still higher um, expression in the Constituent Assembly in France. Coming back to America and looking now at the immediate post-revolutionary period, the period in which the United States were governed by the Articles of Confederation, which were drafted in the heat of the revolution itself. The issue, and there were multiple issues here, right? Some of it has to do with the actual text of the Articles of Confederation. If you haven't read it or read it recently, I'd encourage you to go back to it. This is an exercise I do with my students. Compare the Constitution with the Articles of Confederation. There's really no comparison, just in terms of the language, the precision, the appeal to principle. The Constitution is an obviously superior, deeper, more well thought through document. But having said all of that, it's also the case that the Articles of Confederation just were inadequate to the purposes of government, right? They did not allow for the federal government to collect taxes or print money or regulate interstate commerce or raise a military or take responsibility for national debt. It was really no government at all, just a confederation. And in addition to all of that, and this is where I really want to focus for a moment, the Articles of Confederation tried to bring the institution of lawmaking within the confines of legislatures. But that the people of the United States, in the aftermath of a successful revolution and popular constitution writing, were reluctant to relinquish their greater power over law and policy. And so you had a fairly constant and unruly contest between intra-institutional and extra-institutional politics, the politics of legislatures and the politics of people in the streets. And so part of what the Constitutional Convention was trying to do was to bring politics back indoors. This is, I think, one of the really important themes from Jason Frank's work on post-revolutionary politics. And so the ratification and the convention itself, there's this wonderful quote from Elbridge Gerry at the beginning of the Constitutional Convention: "The evil from which we suffer is an excess of democracy," an idea that apparently expressed the sentiments of most of the framers. The idea here was to confine, constrain popular democracy, to create layers between the people and their legislature, to reincorporate some more aristocratic ideas into the government of the United States, to offset or temper the excess of democracy, and that this was recognized at the time. And this gave rise to a debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, with the Anti-Federalists saying, no, our process may be unruly, it may result in riots and mobs, but at least it's democratic and preservative of freedom. And this is, I think, well regarded as a debate that was not per se won by one side or the other. Remember that we only have a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, which we often hold up as the part of the Constitution that we are most proud of. We only have it because the Anti-Federalists got it as a concession from the Federalists as a condition for the ratification of the Constitution. And I think that dynamic isn't confined just to the Bill of Rights. It plays out over 25 years or longer, an ongoing effort to democratize the Constitution, to continue to assert popular sovereignty over the Constitution, not just as a general principle, but as an active, continuous process that gives the people the capacity to influence how its constitution is understood. Now, in the midst of all of this, we get the famous Marbury v. Madison decision, Chief Justice John Marshall in 1803, asserting that the Supreme Court has final authority to interpret the Constitution and can therefore invalidate as unconstitutional laws enacted by Congress and signed by the president. And I think one way to in a sense, very bluntly summarize Larry Kramer's conclusions is that this was a kind of coup by the court. And again, this was contested. I'll shift ahead now to Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, both of whom run as populists, right? Jefferson as an anti-federalist, right? Assuming the presidency against John Adams in election in which he says we need greater democracy, greater accountability, greater power to the states. And then Jackson, who of course is in the immediate aftermath of full male adult white suffrage, is the first non-Ivy League, non-elite president of the United States, is instead a military man. And the famous case to now connect the populism of early presidents with the contestation of judicial review, there's this famous incident where still Chief Justice John Marshall says to Jackson, you have to respect the treaties with the Cherokee Nation. You can't take their land. And Jackson, probably this is apocryphal, says back, certainly he acts in this way. The Supreme Court has made its decision. Now let it use its army to enforce it. And in fact, Jackson, who's in control of the army, uses the army to carry out his policy against what the Supreme Court has directed him to do, hence the Trail of Tears. And while this is obviously one of the moments in American history we should be most ashamed of, one of the true injustices, I just want to point to a different aspect to it, which is, in a sense, Jackson is saying to the Supreme Court, you represent the old view of the Constitution, the anti-democratic elitist view of the Constitution. Since you were appointed to the court, we've adopted universal suffrage. The people is now broader, and they have changed their mind about what the Constitution means. I am their agent. I'm going to do what they tell me to do, not what you tell me to do. And so the idea that into the 1830s, the question of who has the authority to interpret the Constitution is still up for grabs. I now want to push forward a little bit into Abraham Lincoln and the founding of the Republican Party. And we've talked a little bit about this together before, but it's been a while. The idea that the Republican Party was founded not originally as an abolitionist party, not to get rid of slavery from the original slave states. As a matter of fact, Lincoln was very clear that he respected their right to continue to maintain the institution of slavery. What he and the Republicans opposed was the spread of slavery. And their argument was an anti-oligarchic argument. Heather Cox Richardson's History of the Republican Party is very clear and good on this. The idea being that if you have slavery, the power in that state is very quickly going to be concentrated in the hands of a few very wealthy, very powerful plantation owning men, right? And that in that sense, slavery tends towards oligarchy, which is incompatible with democracy. And if you let more and more states become slave states, it threatens the ability of the United States to maintain its Republican Constitution, its principle of democratic equality. And so ultimately, the Civil War becomes abolitionist, but that's primarily because the South wages the Civil War. The anti oligarchic principle that is at the founding of the Republican Party is returned to, resurrected by Teddy Roosevelt, and then inherited by Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and becomes part of the basis on which FDR, like Jackson before him, contests the authority of the Supreme Court as the ultimate arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution, as he keeps passing the New Deal legislation and the court keeps striking it down. He threatens to pack the court. The court eventually relinquishes. Justices retire. Another justice changes his perspective. And now the New Deal legislation goes through in the name of, implicitly at least, an anti-oligarchic reading of the Constitution, just as slave owners undermine the equality of opportunity and equality of influence of everyone else in their state. The new concentration of wealth and power of the emerging industrialists, the robber barons, the monopolists, the trusts, threatens the ordinary citizen's opportunity and influence. And so the trusts have to be busted and things have to be done to promote the social security and opportunity of ordinary citizens in the name of the Constitution and with the court's blessings. And then the final chapter, and here I'm in a sense moving very quickly to where we are now, is the chapter that, in a sense, I think many of us are most proud of. It's the chapter that includes Brown v. Board of Education and Loving v. Virginia, the central civil rights case asserting fundamental racial equality, that includes protecting the right to contraception, to abortion, to marry whom you wish, irrespective of race or sex. And these decisions, I think, have led many liberals, as well as many conservatives, perhaps down a somewhat different path, to conclude that the Supreme Court should be the sole arbiter of the ultimate meaning of the Constitution, to abandon popular constitutionalism and the less clear cut location of constitutional interpretation that was characteristic of the majority of the history of our society. And I want to suggest, in a sense, unless you do the reading, look at the history, we're prone to a kind of historical amnesia here, in which we think, well, the only thing we can do, let us hope, is change the composition of the Supreme Court. And that has not been the case for the majority of American history, and that we would be well served to revisit that idea, to think again about the way in which we should regard the Constitution, and especially judicial review within it. And so part of the work, especially that Michael Clarman does, is to try to, quote, demythologize the Constitution. We tend to place it on a pedestal, to treat it almost as a sacred document, as the charter of our civil religion. And Clarman is eager to call our attention to the ways in which that was not the case at the founding, the framing, the ratification, and not only that, that there are traces that are obvious once we examine them of the imperfection as well as the contestation around the Constitution. The Three-Fifths Compromise that made African Americans completely devoid of rights, but nevertheless allowed the slave states to count them for three-fifths of a person for the purpose of apportioning votes and representation, right? And then the fact that clearly reveals the Constitution to be a slave charter, right? The Constitution of 1787 accommodates slavery. But then also the Connecticut Compromise, right? This is the compromise that resolved one of the most contentious issues at the Constitutional Convention. Should states be represented proportionate with their population, or should they be represented equally as they were in the Articles of Confederation? And the compromise that Connecticut proposed was combining proportionate with equal representation, where proportionate representation was understood as democratic, one person, one vote, whereas the Senate, which was appointed by state legislatures, was understood as aristocratic. Let us get the best and the brightest of each state into a cooler, more deliberative body to check the tendencies towards extremism and passion of the more representative institution, and then combining those principles of representation in the Electoral College. This was passed on a 5-4 vote. And if you're doing your math, you may say, wait a sec, weren't there 13 states? And part of the point that Claremont and others make is yes, but some of those states weren't there. And almost certainly the Connecticut Compromise wouldn't have passed but for the absence of those states. One of the people who caused the Massachusetts delegation not to be represented had to go back to Boston because he ran out of money and couldn't pay his bill at the inn. We have the Senate, arguably because somebody mismanaged their finances in the Massachusetts delegation, right? And so again, humanizing this document in part by examining its genealogy and recognizing that it's not the work of constitutional Moses has gone up to the mountain, having been dictated the core truth of constitutional law and bringing their tablets back down. This is the work of a group of individuals who, were 50% slave owners, all men, all elite, wealthy, some of them tremendous statesmen, other of them just average people, and they got to vote too, right? And so it's the product of compromise among 18th century thinkers, not the gold standard for constitutional law forever and always. And so if the Constitution we worship is, as Claremont suggests in his title, the product of the framers' coup, part of what we should recognize is that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were not authorized to draft a new constitution. They were sent there to fix the Articles of Confederation, and they took upon themselves a task that in fact far exceeded their mandate. Similarly, the Articles of Confederation said that for changes to be adopted, they had to be unanimously passed by all the states. And the framers said, well, that'll never work. Let's go with 9 out of 13 instead. So they didn't just do something other than what they were told to do. They then changed the very process of ratification. And please note that they were aiming for an avowedly less democratic constitution, right? I've already quoted Governor Gary saying the evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy. I like that expression because it's so concise, but it represents the spirit of Philadelphia of 1787. Similarly, judicial review is the product of Justice Marshall's coup. And while I don't want us to therefore completely throw out the Constitution or completely have it lose its luster, I think that it is a historically important document and one that continues to contain principles that remain relevant today, that we do well by taking our bearings from much of its principled language. We also have to historicize it in order to demythologize it, to make it ours, to recognize that we are still sovereign over it. We still have the right to interpret it. Let us not stand so much in awe of it that we don't also consider it to be the focus of our ongoing exercise of popular political constitutional sovereignty. And that brings me straight to Bruce Ackerman, the sterling professor of constitutional history at Yale Law School, the author of the 3-volume, highly influential History of American Constitutional Law, We the People, and more recently of Revolutionary Foundations. And the unifying thesis of his massive study of constitutionalism is that constitutions, to the extent that they are legitimate, are the products of popular constitutional authority. They are made in the name of the people, and the people therefore has to have input into both their authorship and their interpretation, and that this cannot be a once and done affair. This has to be continuous popular sovereignty over the Constitution, that this is not meaning that every week or every year we have some sort of referendum on what the Constitution means, but as opposed to that, that there are a series of quote constituent moments at which we consider, do we still want to be bound by the way previous generations understood our Constitution, or do we need to reinterpret it in light of altered circumstances, changed norms, different understandings of justice, of democracy, of the people itself? And that on Ackerman's account, we've had at least 3 of these constituent moments. And the way he expresses it, the result is that we really have 3 different constitutions assembled in one document that is housed in the Smithsonian. Despite the fact that it's a single document, the regime of rights, the structure of institutions that have been put in place as an instantiation of that document have been so different at different periods of American history that you have to view it really as a single document that has 3 iterations. The first iteration, the Framers' Constitution, was explicitly enacted and ratified. We can point to Philadelphia and then the state ratification process. The result was a highly contested and exclusive document. It continued to protect slavery. It disenfranchised women and the unpropertied, and there was an ongoing politics of populist mistrust through much of this period. The Framers' Constitution is ultimately overturned by the Civil War and the post-Civil War amendments, the 13th through 15th, which abolished slavery, enshrined due process and equal protection under the law for all persons, and gave all natural born persons in the United States citizenship, right? And the result is a new constitution, as far as Ackerman is concerned, fundamentally opposed to and incompatible with the Framers' Constitution, a constitution that ultimately accommodates Jim Crow, that ultimately leads to the strong concentration of economic and social power characteristic of the last third of the 19th, the first third of the 20th century, the so-called Gilded Age, but that nevertheless also contains the seeds through which progressive politicians ultimately resisted and changed key aspects of this constitution. And that leads us into the third constitution. So this one enacted, this one brought about through amendment. The third constitution is brought about through both amendment and reinterpretation by the Supreme Court, where we get the beginning of the populist anti-oligarchic movement with the progressives in the last third of the 19th century. We get the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, finally giving women the right to vote. And then we get the contest between FDR and the Supreme Court, a contest which FDR ultimately wins without having to pack the court. And the vast expansion of the federal government, the contraction of property and contract right in its importance to overall constitutional law, the expansion of civil rights, which eventually gives rise to the mid-century rights revolution, to civil rights, to rights to privacy, including rights to contraception and abortion and marrying who you want. And that again, this is so different in terms of the processes that it allows, the vast growth of the federal government and executive power within it, and the kinds of rights protected, federalized at the constitutional national level, that this is a distinct constitution. And if Professor Ackerman lives long enough, I wonder whether he will have to issue a fourth volume of We the People, looking at perhaps yet a new era, a new iteration of the Constitution, the one that we stand on the cusp of now, as a more conservative originalist majority takes over in the Supreme Court. If you can bear with me for 5 more minutes, I want to talk with you about one more body of literature that I'm looking at as I think about reform, to restore some of the lost tradition of popular constitutionalism. Really 2 sets of books that I would divide as follows. Adam Cohen's Supreme Inequality, the Supreme Court's 50-year battle for a more unjust America, published just a couple years ago, looking at the way in which the Supreme Court has made it so much harder to unionize, so hard to regulate money in our politics, has consistently seemed to be on the side of the gutting of voting rights legislation or the defanging of antitrust law. And then Ian Milsheiser's Injustices, the Supreme Court's history of comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted, which takes a longer historical scope to argue that the recent period in which the court has become much more inegalitarian, regressive, become a place that the affluent and the powerful go to protect themselves against legislative efforts that have majority support from ordinary people, that this is not just an artifact of the last 50 years. This, in fact, is the dominant tendency of the Supreme Court. Yes, this is the court that gave us Brown v. Board, but before that, it gave us Dred Scott, Plessy v. Ferguson, etc. Yes, this is the court that gave us the right to abortion, but it's probably about to take it away. And at the same time, it's the court that upheld the disenfranchisement of women for a long time. A third and slightly different perspective in this kind of critical theory of the Supreme Court comes from Gerald Rosenberg, a law school professor. The hollow hope: can courts bring about social change? And as the title probably reveals, his answer to that question is no. Generally speaking, the courts are a following, not a leading institution. And the hope perhaps born out of a misunderstanding of the jurisprudence in the middle of the 20th century, that the courts might be the vanguard of progressive social change, is not borne out by the history of the court or by its typical dynamics. Then the second body of literature, all of these books, The Constitution in 2020, which is an anthology by a number of leading constitutional thinkers, Jamal Green, contemporary law school professor at Columbia, How Rights Went Wrong, Mark Tushnet at Stanford, Taking Back the Constitution, Activist Judges and the Next Age of American Law, the very recently published work by Joseph Fishkin and William Forbath, The Anti-Oligarchy Constitution, Reconstructing the Economic Foundations of American Democracy. These four books call for reforms. And to just kind of whet your appetite, I want to suggest that what they're really calling for is two distinct kinds of reform, one of which we could refer to as reforms at the level of political culture, the other at the level of institutions. Starting at that first level, we need to refresh our memory, overcome our amnesia, and bear in mind the complex foundations of democratic constitutionalism. We need to recognize that we are asking the Constitution and the Supreme Court within the framework that it establishes to do some important work for us. Let me start with an analogy, right? If you're on a diet, do you go out and buy 5 gallons of your favorite ice cream, put it in your freezer, and just say, oh, my will is strong enough, I won't eat it, right? Typically, we don't. We recognize that we can be weak-willed. We can get carried away, that right now I'm firmly committed to the diet, but boy, at 11 o'clock at night when I'm watching the Warriors win their championship, I might just feel a bit excessive and oh shoot, I just ate 2 bowls of ice cream, right? So we sometimes want to constrain ourselves to take into account human nature and the fact that we can get carried away by passion, by interest, by momentary fear or partisan division, and that our deeper constitutional principles should constrain our ordinary political conduct. That's why we divide constitutional law from ordinary law, and with constitutional law express as clearly as possible, these are our shared commitments that serve as the basis for ordinary legislative power, and which ordinary legislation has to protect the limits of. And by the way, we're not just saying this, we're going to try to make this commitment as solid as possible by setting up mechanisms that keep us within these bounds. And so if we view the Supreme Court as this kind of institution, an institution of self-constraint, then the Supreme Court has an important role to play, right? And that is, as Frank Michelman puts it, the people's principles. They are there to remind us of our constitutional commitments, to enforce our commitments when we exceed what we in principle have said our constraints are. But that doesn't mean that we have ceded to the court the exclusive power to interpret the Constitution. That if anything, we also ask our justices, our judges, our court system to continue to extend and reinterpret the Constitution in light of our changing understandings of our circumstances, our principles, what justice requires of us now, not what it required of us 50 or 230 years ago. And this means then that there will likely be a complex and dispersed work of interpreting the Constitution, in which the political and more representative branches are co-equals in the conversation about what the Constitution means with the Supreme Court. And all of these institutions, the Supreme Court, Congress, and the president, are ultimately trying to be in dialogue with the people about what our Constitution means. That we have lost track of that dimension of our politics and that we would be well served to resume it is, I think, one of the central lessons that I take away from reading this constitutional history. Related idea, and this goes back to the Fishkin and Forbath book just published on the anti-oligarchic constitution, is that we would be well served, especially in our new Gilded Age, as we've seen this extraordinary growth of inequality, this deep concentration of wealth and power in the top 10 and 1 and 0.1% of the population, well served to remember the alternative strain of constitutionalism from Jefferson to Lincoln to Franklin Delano Roosevelt that says the Constitution needs to enable the people to continue to create through its legislation social conditions that allow for equal opportunity and equal influence in our society, right? And so this would involve then changing the way in which the Constitution is currently understood to return it again to an earlier understanding. I've spoken with you in the past about narrow institutional reform. I think there are at least three good ideas floating out there coming out of Jamal Green, out of the President's Commission on the Supreme Court, other authors as well, and they're not terribly surprising. Expanding but not packing the court. So if we're going to increase the size of the Supreme Court, as I think we would be well served to do, so that we don't get the scenario in which Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, is replaced by Amy Coney Barrett, and one justice changing is the genesis of a sea change in the court. If there's 15, the power is more dispersed. But if we're going to expand the court, we can't just do it overnight. We can't give Joe Biden, as much as some of us might want, 5 new appointments to the court, because then it will be seen as explicitly partisan, and that will further damage the standing and credibility of the court. So if we're going to expand it by 5 justices, we should do that perhaps over a 10 or 12-year period, so that at least a couple presidents have the opportunity to appoint new justices to new positions, and presumably there will be some alternation between the two parties. And by the way, this might help the more cultural kinds of reforms as well, in that knowing that the next president will appoint 2 or 3 at least members of the court may make us more attuned in our ordinary politics to its constitutional dimensions and implications. Generous term limits. I'll throw out the idea of 20 years here. And so the basic idea is that we should not make this lifelong appointments. We are living much longer today. People are being appointed younger. And the consequence of lifetime appointment is that you have people on the court for 30, 35, 40 years, and they lose touch with changes occurring in the broader society and culture. It's too concentrated a power to allow someone to serve their entire life. You do want them to be able to have security, to evolve, to find their footing. You want there to be a generous term, maybe 20 years, but you also want term limits. Finally, panel and rotation reforms. This is something that Jamal Green calls our attention to from Germany. The idea that you don't actually appoint justices directly to the Supreme Court. You appoint your federal bench, and then from among those judges, you have a lottery to see who will be on the high court for 5 years, and then they go back off the high court and back into the federal bench. This makes the body more deliberative, more prone to compromise. It also makes appointing of judges a more ordinary exercise in which hopefully political considerations as opposed to judicial temperament and constitutional philosophy are less important. Finally, again, this is a little wide of the field, but I think it's worthwhile emphasizing the reason we have such a conservative Supreme Court in 2022 is because of other structures in the Constitution that amplify the power of a minority of the American population that doesn't look or think like the majority of the population. And so we should probably also be thinking about fixing those aspects of the Constitution, whether that's giving the more populous states one more senator each, so that the Senate is not so grossly disproportionate in its amplification of small states' powers, allowing Washington, D.C. statehood. So it has representation in the Senate so that its citizens are not disenfranchised. And please note that this is millions of people. It would be a mid-sized state if it were given statehood. Legislatively bypassing the Electoral College so that the winner of the popular vote becomes the president. And obviously this could change dramatically the incentives for the Republican Party to become a modern conservative party that has to appeal to an increasingly diverse electorate. And then finally, right, the circular chicken and egg nature of all this comes home. We need a differently constituted Supreme Court to probably address gerrymandering and to do something about the ballot access issues at the state level. It would be a good democracy promoting thing to try to make our elections more responsive, our districts less carved up for partisan advantage, and to encourage citizens to vote. There you have it, the pie in the sky agenda for returning us to constitutional democracy in the way that it was practiced perhaps the first 150 years of our society for the remainder of the 21st century. I'm listening. I want to hear your comments. I'm also going to get my plug so my computer doesn't crash. Who wants to start us out? Flossie, go ahead. I see you. I'm just.
See, okay. Might it not be a good idea to examine the actual language of the Constitution and to see if we might breathe more light into it by examining how much the passive voice prevents our active thinking? And the illustration I'm offering, and I'm using the passive voice now, is best illustrated by that moment when the gentleman from Mississippi pointed out that the 12th Amendment is enunciated in the passive voice. Ballots will be counted. We need a prepositional phrase to follow. By whom? Who will do the counting? So instead of the ballots will be counted, who will count them? So all you need is a slippery mind to say, it doesn't tell us, so we will tell you. Machines will do the counting, or representatives from the Republican Party will be responsible for the counting. And what it brings to mind, much as I recognize how subtle the passive voice can be, it also is a way for politicians to disguise their thinking or to deny that they ever had any thoughts at all.
Interesting and obviously relevant. Thank you, Flossie. And
Yes, I'm an English teacher, of course.
I recognize, yes, passive voice, etc. So let me start out by saying your concern is not merely that of a grammarian, obviously, right? Your concern is the mischief that the ambiguity or the passivity of this language gives rise to. And so I'll just start by saying, yes, that's in a part the premise of this whole 4-week tour we've been on, is that we are in dangerous times, and that the Constitution, but the principled commitment of the people that it represents to constrain ourselves so as to respect each other's equality and rights, that equality includes the idea that each of us has an equally weighted vote, and that the only fair way to determine who gets to exercise executive or legislative power is by determining which candidate, which party gets the most equally weighted votes, right? That perhaps needs to be better articulated within our constitutional framework, although it is clearly understood by a whole series of Supreme Court decisions, right? But that perhaps it also needs to be clarified legislatively, right? The idea that our election law basically is still governed by 19th century statutes that also have a lot of ambiguity seems to be part of the problem here. And then I'll just add, right, while we need the Constitution and legislation to do the work of setting the guardrails, of telling us exactly how we're going to institutionalize the voting process, we also need goodwill. We also need principled commitment to the underlying principle of equal citizenship, right? And part of the problem here, I don't think we're going to be able to do this by law alone, constitutional or ordinary legislation, if a substantial portion of our party, of our citizens, of our people, turns against another portion of our population and seeks to deny them equality. Again, one of the things we learn from looking at the history of the United States from a constitutional perspective is that there has always been a white supremacist party. There has always been an effort to prevent African Americans, especially, from exercising full equal rights with citizens of European descent. And as we become an increasingly diverse society, the fragility of white power also leads to it becoming more aggressive and pernicious, right? And so, in a sense, we have to not only fight for better laws, we have to fight for the principles and for making them compelling for those who are tempted to disagree. Thank you, Flossie. As always, a good, productive way to get us started. Anybody else with a thought for today? I know I ran long today. I was trying to finish this off.
Hold on.
Anybody else?
Thank you.
You're welcome, Flossie. As always. Anybody else with a comment for today? I'll let you guys go have lunch. I'll look forward to being there in person next week. Take care, everybody. Be well. Good.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.